The morning arrived without fanfare, creeping across the Belgian countryside like something reluctant to be witnessed. It was January 1945, the 6th day of the month, and the earth itself seemed exhausted, worn down by years of war that had trampled every field, burned every barn, turned every road into a scar across the landscape. The snow-covered fields stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of old steel, that particular shade of gray that holds no promise of clearing, no hint of sun, just an infinite ceiling of cloud that pressed down like a lid on a coffin. The cold was not just temperature but a presence, a weight that pressed against the skin and settled in the lungs with every breath, making each inhalation feel like swallowing shards of glass. The trees stood bare and skeletal, their branches reaching upward in silent supplication or accusation. It was impossible to tell which. In the fading darkness before dawn, when the world existed in that liminal space between night and day, the mechanical growl of a Tiger I tank rumbled through the stillness, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and primal, and full of barely restrained violence. The tank's massive form cast long shadows across the frozen landscape, 57 tons of steel and fury moving with surprising grace for something so massive, its wide tracks crushing the frozen earth beneath it, leaving deep impressions that would remain long after the tank had passed, long after the men inside it had become memories or ghosts or statistics in a war that consumed everything it touched. Inside the steel belly of the beast, Oberleutnant Ernst Bäumer sat in the commander's cupola, his gloved hands resting on the edge of the hatch, feeling the vibration of the engine through the metal, a constant tremor that had become so familiar he noticed it more when it stopped than when it continued. At 32 years old, his face carried the worn lines of a man who had seen too many winters, too many battles, too many friends vanish into the smoke and chaos of a war that seemed to have no end. His eyes, once bright with the fervor of youth and duty, now held only a quiet resignation, the kind that settles into a soldier's bones when he realizes that survival is less about skill and more about chance, about being in the right place when the shell lands in the wrong one, about the random mercy of physics and trajectory that separates the living from the dead by mere centimeters. He had commanded this tiger since the summer of 1944. Through the desperate retreats across France, through the blood-soaked hedgerows of Normandy where every lane was a killing ground, through the frozen nightmare of the Ardennes where men froze to death in their foxholes, and tanks became metal tombs when their engines seized in the cold. The tank was more than a machine to him now. It was a companion in the way that only shared suffering creates companionship, a shelter from a world that wanted him dead, a tomb waiting to be sealed but somehow, impossibly, still moving, still fighting, still carrying them forward or backward or wherever the war demanded they go. He had named the tank, though he told no one this, not even his crew. He called it Marguerite, after his sister, who had died of scarlet fever when she was 7 and he was 9. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, he would rest his forehead against the cold metal and whisper apologies for the things he had done, the orders he had followed, the men he had killed or watched die. The tank never answered, but it kept moving, and that was enough. That had to be enough. Below him, in the driver's compartment where the world was reduced to narrow vision slits and the constant roar of the Maybach engine, Feldwebel Klaus Richter gripped the steering levers with hands that had long ago lost their feeling, the thick gloves doing little to protect against the cold that seeped through every gap in the armor, every joint in the metal that was supposed to keep them safe but instead became a conductor for the winter's bite. He was 24, though the war had aged him in ways that numbers could not measure, had carved years into his face with the chisel of exhaustion and fear and the terrible burden of staying alert every moment, because a moment's inattention meant death, yours or your crew's, and that weight never lifted, never eased, never allowed you the luxury of true rest. His family had been tanners in Bavaria, generations of men and women working with leather and patience, trades that required steady hands and careful attention. The kind of work where rushing meant ruining, where quality mattered more than speed. His father had wanted him to join the business, had been teaching him the craft since he was old enough to hold a knife, showing him how to read the hide, how to know when the leather was ready, how to work with the material rather than against it. Now those same hands, trained for delicacy and precision, guided 57 tons of steel and fury through terrain that wanted nothing more than to swallow them whole, through mud that could trap them, through snow that concealed mines and tank traps, and all the invisible ways that war had of killing you without ever firing a shot. He could feel every vibration of the Maybach engine through the metal seat, 700 horsepower thrumming beneath him like a caged animal. Every grinding shift of the transmission as it struggled to convert that raw power into forward motion, into the movement that meant life. Because a stationary tank was a dead tank, always had been, always would be. Lately, there had been sounds that should not be there, grinding noises deep in the mechanical guts of the beast that spoke of metal wearing against metal, of components pushed beyond their design limits, beyond their endurance, beyond any reasonable expectation of continued function. He had mentioned it to Bäumer, had tried to explain that something fundamental was wrong, that the transmission was not just wearing out, but actively dying. And Bäumer had listened with those tired eyes and said there was nothing to be done, no replacement parts, no mechanics who knew the system well enough to repair it, even if parts existed, just orders to keep moving, keep fighting, keep pretending that machines could run on will alone, when oil and steel were what they actually needed. The Tiger I was a legend, a monster that struck fear into enemy hearts with its thick armor, that could shrug off hits that would destroy lesser tanks, and its devastating 88mm gun that could punch through enemy armor at ranges that seemed impossible, that turned battles into executions, that made American and British tankers check their wills before climbing into their Shermans and Cromwells because everyone knew the mathematics. A Tiger could kill you from 2 kilometers away while your own gun was still useless against its frontal armor. But legends have weaknesses, secrets that undermine their invincibility, and the Tiger's was hidden deep in its mechanical heart, buried in the complexity of the Maybach-Olvar transmission that connected the roaring engine to the driving sprockets, that translated raw power into controlled movement. It was an engineering marvel when it worked, a sophisticated piece of German engineering that represented the pinnacle of pre-war automotive design, capable of translating 700 horsepower into movement with precision and grace, allowing the massive tank to pivot in place, to move forward or backward with equal facility, to navigate terrain that should have been impassable for something so heavy. The transmission had been designed by Maybach, the company known for luxury automobiles and precision engineering, designed in peacetime by men in clean labs who calculated tolerances and stress factors on paper, who tested components in controlled environments where temperature was constant, where maintenance was regular, where the machinery was operated by trained technicians who understood its complexity. But it was also a nightmare of complexity, a labyrinth of gears and hydraulics and synchromesh bands that demanded perfection in maintenance, perfection in operation, perfection in conditions that war never provided, could never provide, would never provide, no matter how carefully you planned or how desperately you hoped. The transmission required regular oil changes with specific grades of lubricant that were increasingly unavailable as supply lines collapsed. It required adjustment of hydraulic pressures that could only be done by mechanics with specialized training, and those mechanics were dead or captured or transferred to other fronts where they were needed more. It required replacement of worn components before they failed catastrophically, but replacement parts were manufactured in factories that were now rubble under Allied bombs, in cities that burned while their inhabitants fled or died, or tried to pretend that tomorrow would somehow be different from today. And now, in the winter of 1945, with spare parts scarce and qualified mechanics scattered or dead, with the war entering its final desperate phase where every day brought new retreats and new defeats and new orders that made less sense than the ones before, that transmission was beginning to fail, was actively dying, was grinding itself to death with every kilometer, every shift, every demand placed upon it by men who needed it to work because their lives depended on its function. In the turret, in the cramped space where a man had to fold himself around machinery and ammunition, Unteroffizier Hans Kepler sat at the gunner's position, his eye pressed to the sight even though there was nothing yet to see through the morning gloom. Just the gray landscape unfolding before him in shades of white and darker white, snow and shadow, emptiness punctuated by the occasional skeletal tree or ruined building. He was the youngest of the crew at 21, barely old enough to legally drink in the beer halls of his hometown, though he had tasted more death than most men experience in a full lifetime, had seen things that no amount of years or wisdom could prepare a person to witness. He was a boy from Cologne, from the old city on the Rhine where the cathedral spires reached toward heaven and the river flowed eternal and unchanging through centuries of human drama. And he had joined the Wehrmacht with dreams of glory and service, with visions of parades and medals and stories he would tell his grandchildren someday about the time he helped defend the fatherland. He had returned home on leave in October, his first leave in 8 months, and found his neighborhood reduced to rubble by Allied bombers, the 1,000 bomber raids that came night after night, turning cities into infernos, reducing civilization to ash and dust, and the screaming of people who burned alive in their cellars, while the bombs kept falling and falling and falling until there was nothing left to burn. His mother and sister had survived, living in the basement of what had once been their home, now just walls and chimney, standing amid rubble like broken teeth in a diseased jaw. They lived on rations that were never enough, wore clothes that were more patched than original fabric, burned furniture for warmth because there was no coal, no wood, nothing but what you could scavenge from the ruins. His mother had gripped his hand when he left, had held on with a strength that surprised him because she had always seemed so delicate, so refined, the kind of woman who worried about proper manners and appropriate dress even as the world collapsed around them. She had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had watched her city die and her neighbors die and her husband die. Yes, his father had died in the Russian winter of 1942, frozen in some nameless forest whose location they would never know because the army letter said only "killed in action," as if those 3 words could encompass the end of a man who had taught Klaus to ride a bicycle and to appreciate Bach and to believe that kindness mattered even when the world was cruel. His mother had gripped his hand and whispered a single word: live. It was not a command. It was not even a request. It was a prayer, desperate and heartfelt and probably futile, because prayers in 1945 seemed to bounce off that gray sky and fall back to earth unanswered, or if answered, answered with more suffering, more loss, more proof that whatever God might have once watched over them had either died or lost interest, or decided that humanity needed to learn a lesson written in blood and fire. Now, as he sat in the tight confines of the turret, surrounded by brass casings and the smell of oil and cordite that seemed to have permanently embedded itself in his skin, in his clothes, in the very fiber of his being, he wondered if prayers still reached whatever God watched over this frozen hell, if heaven was still taking messages from earth, or if the line had been disconnected sometime around 1939, when all of this madness began. The loader, Gefreiter Otto Weiss, methodically checked each round of ammunition, his movements automatic after months of repetition, hands moving with practiced efficiency even though his mind was elsewhere, perhaps back in the fields of home, perhaps nowhere at all, just existing in that state of suspended consciousness that soldiers learn to inhabit when the alternative is thinking too much about where they are and what they are doing and how likely it is that they will not see another spring. He was 38, the oldest of the crew by a significant margin, nearly old enough to be father to Kepler and uncle to the others, a farmer who had been called up when Germany needed every man it could find, when the age exemptions were lifted and the definitions of fit for service were expanded to include Men who should have been considered too old, too valuable in their civilian roles, too necessary to the feeding of a nation that was slowly starving as the war consumed everything. His back ached constantly from the work of hefting the heavy shells, each one weighing more than 20 kilograms, lifting them from the racks where they were stored, maneuvering them in the cramped space of the turret, ramming them home into the breech of the 88mm gun, again and again and again, until his muscles screamed and his spine felt like it might crack. His hands were covered in small cuts and bruises that never quite healed, constant minor injuries that accumulated because there was no time for them to recover, no rest period long enough for skin to properly close and strengthen before it was torn open again by another rough edge, another sharp corner, another moment of haste when care would have prevented injury, but haste was survival. But he never complained. Complaining changed nothing. He had learned that lesson in the wheat fields of his youth, where weather and fate determined harvest, where you could pray for rain and receive drought, where you could do everything right and still watch your crops fail because nature owed you nothing, cared nothing for your plans or your needs or your survival. All a man could do was work and hope. Work because work was the only thing within your control. Hope because without hope there was only despair, and despair was a luxury that farmers could not afford, that soldiers could not afford, that men who wanted to see tomorrow could not afford. In the tank, it was no different. Work, hope, survive, load the shell. Do not think about where it is going or who it will kill. Do not think about the men in the enemy tank who might have wives, children, mothers who whisper prayers for their safety. Do not think about anything except the next shell, the next breath, the next moment. That was how you survived. Not by being brave or strong or righteous, but by narrowing your focus to the immediate, to the mechanical, to the things you could control in a world that was overwhelmingly beyond your control. Their orders were simple in their impossibility, written on paper by men who would never see the crossroads they were ordering defended, who would never feel the cold, or hear the grinding of a failing transmission, or watch friends die for ground that meant nothing. Hold the crossroads at Saint-Vith against the American advance for as long as possible. Delay their movement east. Buy time for the retreating units to establish new defensive positions further back. Positions that would also fail, that would also be abandoned, that would also become just another name on a map marking where German soldiers had died for a cause that was already lost, but that no one in command would admit was lost, because to admit it was to admit that all the death had been for nothing, that every sacrifice had been wasted, that the entire terrible edifice of the war was built on lies and hubris, and the grotesque miscalculation of men who sent others to die while they remained safe in their bunkers and headquarters and offices. High command, somewhere far behind the lines in their warm offices, with their maps covered in neat symbols that represented tank divisions and infantry units, but never represented the reality of exhausted men and broken machines and supply lines that existed only on paper, believed that a single tiger could make a difference, that the mere presence of such a formidable machine would slow the enemy, would make them cautious, would buy precious hours or days before the inevitable happened, and the line collapsed again, and the retreat continued, and the war ground on toward its conclusion. They believed this, or pretended to believe it, because the alternative was admitting that nothing could stop what was coming, that the American and British and Soviet armies were going to roll over Germany like a tide over sandcastles, washing away everything in their path until there was nothing left but occupied territory and the bitter taste of defeat. Bäumer had read the orders without expression, his face giving nothing away, because he had learned long ago that showing what you felt was weakness. That command meant maintaining the illusion of confidence even when you had none. That men needed to believe their commander knew what he was doing, even when the commander knew he was leading them toward probable death. He folded the paper with careful precision, creased it along straight lines, tucked it into his jacket pocket where it rested against his heart like a death sentence awaiting execution. He knew what they really meant. Die slowly instead of quickly. Sell your lives at the highest possible price. Make the enemy pay for every meter of ground they take. And pretend that it matters. Pretend that your sacrifice will be remembered. Pretend that there is meaning in holding a crossroads that will be forgotten within a week of your death. But he did not say any of this to his crew. He simply gave them the coordinates, told them they were moving out at dawn, and watched as they went through their pre-combat rituals, checking equipment, writing letters they might never send, smoking cigarettes down to the filter, doing all the small things that men do when they know death is waiting but do not know if it will come today or tomorrow or next week. The Tiger lurched forward as Richter engaged the gears, and immediately the transmission protested with a grinding whine that made everyone inside wince, a sound like metal screaming, like something living being slowly tortured to death. It was the sound of something breaking, something essential giving way under pressure it was never meant to endure, never designed to handle, never tested for in the clean laboratories where engineers had drawn their diagrams and calculated their tolerances without ever imagining that their beautiful machine would be asked to operate in conditions like this, with oil that was too thick for the cold, with components worn beyond recognition, with maintenance schedules that existed only as suggestions that no one could follow because there was no time, no parts, no mechanics, nothing but the desperate hope that the machine would continue functioning through sheer force of will. Richter felt it through the levers, a resistance that should not be there, a hesitation in the machine's response, like a horse that has been ridden too hard and is beginning to refuse, beginning to recognize that what is being asked of it is impossible. The steering levers, which should have moved smoothly with hydraulic assist, now felt stiff, recalcitrant, fighting him with every adjustment. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold, could feel his heart rate increasing because he knew, had known for days now, that the transmission was dying and that when it finally gave up completely, they would be stranded, immobile, helpless, just a steel box waiting for American tank destroyers to reduce them to burning wreckage and charred corpses. He had reported it 3 days ago to the maintenance officer, a harried hauptmann who looked like he had not slept in a week, whose uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly, whose hands shook slightly when he looked at the maintenance reports that covered his desk, like accusations, like evidence of a systemic failure that no amount of effort could overcome. The hauptmann had looked at him with exhausted eyes that held no hope, no solutions, nothing but the hollow acceptance of a man who had been asked to perform miracles with no tools and no time and no possibility of success, and said there were no replacement parts, no time for major repairs even if parts existed, no options except to keep it running as long as you can. Those had been his exact words. Keep it running as long as you can. Not keep it running, not maintain it properly. Just as long as you can. An admission that failure was inevitable, that they were not trying to prevent the breakdown but merely delay it, buying time with a machine that was already broken, already dying, already past the point where maintenance could save it. That is the only order that matters now, the hauptmann had said, and Richter had understood that this was true not just for the transmission but for everything, for the entire German army, for the entire war effort, for the entire nation that was collapsing like a building whose foundation had been eaten away by time and hubris, and the inexorable mathematics of industrial warfare, where Germany simply did not have enough men, enough tanks, enough oil, enough anything, to win against enemies that had all of those things, and were willing to spend them without limit until victory was achieved. The road to Saint-Vith was a ribbon of frozen mud and snow, rutted by the passage of countless vehicles, lined with the skeletal remains of trees that artillery had stripped of bark and branch, leaving them standing like monuments to destruction, like grave markers for a forest that had once been green and alive and full of birds that sang in spring. The landscape was a study in desolation, a masterpiece of gray and white, painted by the war's indifferent brush. Every farmhouse, a burned shell with roof collapsed and walls blackened by fire. Every field, a minefield of craters and debris, where nothing would grow for years after the armies had passed, where the earth itself had been poisoned by explosives and oil and the chemical residue of modern warfare. The morning light, what little of it penetrated the cloud cover, revealed a world drained of color, drained of life, drained of any indication that human beings had once lived here with hopes and families and routines that had nothing to do with killing or dying. They passed a burned-out American Sherman tank, its turret blown clean off by some catastrophic internal explosion, probably an ammunition hit that had cooked off every shell in the fighting compartment, in a chain reaction of fire and pressure that would have killed the crew instantly, which was a mercy in a war where mercy was rare. The Sherman sat at an angle in the ditch beside the road, and beside it, partially covered by snow that the wind had sculpted into a drift, lay the frozen body of a soldier whose face was turned toward the sky, as if asking a question that would never be answered, as if waiting for an explanation that would never come. His uniform identified him as American, one of the thousands of young men who had crossed the Atlantic, thinking they were bringing liberation to Europe, finding instead that war was war, regardless of which side you fought for, that dying hurt the same in any language, that your mother's grief would be identical to the grief of mothers on the other side, whose sons were also frozen in ditches, also staring at skies that did not care, also transformed from living, breathing humans with names and families and futures into just another casualty statistic, another body count, another piece of data in the massive accounting of death that the war generated with industrial efficiency. Kepler looked away from the corpse, but the image remained, printed on his mind like all the others, an endless gallery of death that he carried with him into every battle, every engagement, every moment when he pressed his eye to the gun sight and aimed at another tank that contained other men who were probably scared and cold and hoping to survive just like he was hoping to survive, just like everyone on both sides was hoping to survive, even though mathematics and tactics and the laws of probability meant that many would not, that some would die today and others tomorrow and still others next week. But eventually, if the war went on long enough, everyone's number would come up, everyone's luck would run out. Everyone would join the gallery of frozen faces staring at uncaring skies. The transmission made the sound again, louder this time, more insistent, more desperate, a screech of metal on metal that cut through the engine's rumble like a knife, like a warning that could not be ignored, like the death rattle of something that had been pushed beyond endurance and was now actively disintegrating. Richter's jaw tightened, muscles bunching along the line of his clenched teeth. And he eased off the throttle, trying to baby the dying machine, trying to coax a few more kilometers from components that were already operating on borrowed time. His movements became even more careful, each shift of the gears executed with the delicacy of a surgeon, each steering input minimal and controlled, trying to reduce the stress, reduce the demand, reduce anything that might be the final straw that caused the entire system to seize up completely. But the transmission was beyond babying now, beyond coaxing, beyond any technique or skill that Richter possessed. It was failing on a fundamental level, gears grinding against each other because the teeth were worn smooth, hydraulic pressure dropping because seals had given up, synchronizers no longer synchronizing because the bronze material had been scoured away by thousands of shifts, tens of thousands of shifts. More shifts than the designers had ever intended or tested for, because they had designed it for peacetime maneuvers, where tanks went back to depot after every exercise, where maintenance was thorough and regular, and performed by specialists with the proper tools and parts. They had not designed it for months of continuous operation, for crew members who were exhausted and undertrained in maintenance procedures, for oil that was contaminated with dirt and metal particles, because filters were not changed often enough, for cold that made lubricants thick and sluggish, for heat that came from constant operation without adequate cooling periods, for all the abuse that combat conditions inevitably inflicted on even the best designed machinery. In the commander's cupola, Bäumer heard it too and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The physical sensation of dread that comes when you recognize that something terrible is beginning to happen and you are powerless to stop it, can only watch as it unfolds with the inevitability of tragedy. A Tiger without mobility was just an expensive pillbox. A stationary gun platform that could fire until its ammunition ran out but could not maneuver, could not reposition, could not retreat when the tactical situation demanded it. And a pillbox could not retreat. A pillbox could only sit and die, slowly or quickly depending on how competent the enemy was, how much ammunition they were willing to expend, how patient they were in working their way around to find the vulnerable spots that every armored vehicle had, that no amount of armor could completely eliminate. If the transmission failed completely, they would be stationary, vulnerable, waiting for the inevitable moment when an American shell found exactly the right angle, exactly the right weak point, and turned their steel sanctuary into a steel coffin. They reached the crossroads just as dawn broke properly, the weak winter sun finally managing to push above the horizon, casting long shadows across the intersection of two narrow roads that met at a right angle in the middle of fields that had probably once grown wheat or potatoes, but now grew only snow and the wreckage of war. It was not much to defend, just a crossing of dirt tracks in the middle of nowhere, unmarked except for a broken wooden signpost that leaned at an angle like a drunk trying to remember which way was home. Its painted letters so faded and damaged that it was impossible to read what destinations it had once indicated. But in war, even nowhere matters, if someone decides it does. If some general or colonel or major draws a line on a map and says, "This must be held, this must be defended," this intersection of nothing in particular becomes the focus of tactical planning and artillery coordinates and radio reports, becomes a place where men will kill and die, not because it has inherent value, but because it has been assigned value by people who will never see it, will never stand in its frozen mud and wonder why they are being asked to bleed for it. Bäumer ordered Richter to position the Tiger behind a low stone wall that ran along the northern edge of the crossroads, one of those ancient walls that farmers had built generations ago to mark property boundaries or keep livestock contained. Walls that had endured through seasons and years and now provided a modicum of cover, though cover was always relative when you were talking about anti-tank guns and shells that could punch through steel. The positioning had to be exact, angling the tank to maximize the armor's effectiveness, while giving Kepler a clear field of fire down both approaches, both roads that led to the crossroads from east and west. The Tiger's frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Allied tank guns at combat ranges, but the side armor was vulnerable, and the rear armor might as well be paper for all the protection it offered against a determined attack. Positioning meant everything. It meant the difference between surviving the first volley and burning before you got off a shot. The movement required precision, careful manipulation of the steering levers, Richter's hands moving with the practiced skill of a man who had done this dozens of times, hundreds of times, who knew his tank's turning radius and pivot point as intimately as he knew his own body's capabilities. But with each turn, with each adjustment, with each micro-correction to get the angle just right, the transmission screamed its protest. The grinding of abused metal rising in pitch and intensity until it seemed impossible that the components had not simply welded themselves together from friction and heat and the molecular-level destruction that was occurring inside. That steel housing where gears that should mesh smoothly were instead tearing at each other, like animals fighting to the death. They had been in position for less than an hour when the sound of engines reached them from the east. American engines, the distinctive whine of Shermans, and the rumble of half-tracks. Bäumer raised his binoculars and scanned the tree line, counting shapes moving between the skeletal trees. 3 Shermans, possibly 4, supported by infantry in white winter camouflage. Not overwhelming odds for a Tiger, not under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. Nothing about this war was normal anymore. The Americans advanced cautiously, aware that Tigers operated in this sector, aware of the terrible mathematics of an engagement where one German tank could destroy 5 or 6 of theirs before falling. Bäumer watched them come, his hand resting on the intercom switch, ready to give the order that would transform this frozen morning into chaos and fire. Beside him, Kepler had already acquired the lead Sherman in his sight, his finger light on the trigger, waiting for the word that would send an 88mm shell screaming across the snow. But Bäumer did not give the order. Not yet. Every shot would draw their position like a beacon, and once revealed, they would have to move. And moving meant trusting the transmission to hold, to not choose this moment of all moments to give up its ghost. He watched the Americans advance another 50 meters, close enough now that he could see individual soldiers moving behind the tanks, their weapons held ready, their breath visible in the cold air. They were young, he realized, as young as Kepler, as young as he had been when this war started, a lifetime ago. The decision was made for him when the lead Sherman's turret swiveled in their direction, some sixth sense or training, or pure dumb luck causing the American commander to focus on the stone wall where the Tiger waited. Bäumer saw the barrel elevate slightly, saw the muzzle flash, and then the world became noise and violence. The shell struck the stone wall 3 meters to their left, exploding in a shower of frozen earth and rock fragments. The Americans had spotted them. "Fire!" Bäumer commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Kepler squeezed the trigger, and the Tiger's gun roared, the recoil rocking the entire tank. Through the smoke and dust, they saw the result. The lead Sherman stopped, as if it had hit an invisible wall, a neat hole punched through its frontal armor. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the hatches flew open and men scrambled out, their movements frantic, desperate, the tank already burning from within. Kepler was already traversing to the next target, Weiss already loading another shell, the crew working with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this too many times to count. The second Sherman exploded before it could return fire, the shell finding its ammunition storage and turning the tank into a brief, brilliant fireball that cast dancing shadows across the snow. But the Americans were not retreating. They were professionals, and they understood the equation. Spread out, flank, overwhelm, the remaining tanks split apart, moving to opposite sides of the crossroads, trying to get an angle on the Tiger's weaker side armor. Infantry began laying down, suppressing fire, the staccato crack of rifles and the chatter of machine guns filling the air. "Move," Bäumer ordered, and Richter engaged the gears. The transmission shrieked in agony, a sound so terrible that for a moment everyone in the tank stopped breathing. The Tiger shuddered, lurched forward 3 meters, and then stopped. The engine was still running, still roaring with power, but that power was not reaching the drive sprockets. The transmission had failed. Completely, catastrophically, irreparably. "We are stuck," Richter reported, his voice carefully neutral, though his hands were shaking on the useless steering levers. The Tiger, pride of the Panzerwaffe, ultimate expression of German engineering, was now nothing more than a stationary gun platform with American tanks maneuvering for killing shots on its flanks. Bäumer felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a physical thing. He could order the crew to bail out, to abandon the tank and try to escape on foot through the snow and the enemy infantry. Some might make it, probably none would. Or they could stay, fight from the disabled tank until ammunition ran out, or an American shell found the right angle, the right weak point. Either way, the ending was written. The transmission, that marvel of engineering that was supposed to be the Tiger's strength, had become its executioner. He looked at his crew, these men who had trusted him, followed him, survived with him, through hell after hell. Kepler, barely old enough to shave, his eyes still pressed to the gun sight. Weiss, the farmer who should have been home tending his fields, loading another shell with methodical care. Richter, the tanner's son, staring at the steering levers as if will alone could make them function. These were not names in a casualty report. These were men. His men. "Keep firing," he ordered. Kepler did not hesitate. The gun roared again, and a third Sherman died. But the fourth was almost in position now, moving through the trees to their left, where the Tiger's armor was thinner, where a good shot would penetrate. Bäumer traversed the turret manually, trying to bring the gun to bear. But the tank could not pivot, could not angle, could not do anything but sit and wait for the inevitable. The American shell struck low on the left side, punching through the sponson armor and into the engine compartment. The Tiger shuddered, and smoke began to pour from the vents. "Fire," someone said, though Bäumer was not sure who. Fire in a tank was not like fire in a building. There was no exit, no escape route. There were hatches, but opening them meant exposing yourself to enemy fire. Not opening them meant burning. "Out!" Bäumer commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Everyone out! Now!" He popped the commander's hatch and pulled himself up into daylight and incoming fire. A bullet sparked off the hatch rim inches from his head, and he dropped back down instinctively, then forced himself up again. Kepler was climbing out of the turret hatch, moving fast, and Bäumer grabbed his arm and half pushed, half threw him off the tank. Richter and Weiss were scrambling out through the driver's hatches, and behind them, flames were already licking up from the engine deck. They ran. There was no dignity in it, no heroism, just 4 men in field gray sprinting across open snow, while machine gun fire kicked up frozen earth around their boots. Richter went down first, a bullet catching him in the leg, and Weiss, the farmer who understood duty in a way that city boys never quite grasped, stopped and went back for him. They never made it to the tree line. Bäumer saw them fall, saw them become still shapes in the snow, and he kept running because stopping meant joining them, and his legs would not obey the part of him that wanted to. Kepler was still beside him, the boy moving with the speed of youth and terror, and together they crashed into the sparse cover of a drainage ditch, gasping for air that felt like knives in their lungs. Behind them, the Tiger was fully engulfed now, ammunition cooking off in sharp cracks that sounded almost festive, almost celebratory. 75 tons of steel and engineering genius, rendered impotent by a transmission that could not bear the weight of its own ambition. They lay in the ditch for hours, not daring to move, listening to the sounds of the American advance continue past them. Tanks rumbled by, infantry trudged through the snow, voices called out in English, clearing buildings that were already empty, securing a crossroads that no longer mattered. When darkness finally came, Bäumer and Kepler crawled west, through frozen fields and past burned villages, 2 more pieces of a shattered army, trying to find something that no longer existed. 3 days later, they reached German lines, or what passed for lines in those final months when everything was falling apart. They reported to a major who barely looked at them, who took down their names and unit numbers with the mechanical efficiency of a man filling out forms for the dead. The Tiger was lost, Bäumer reported. Transmission failure. The major nodded as if this was not news, as if every day brought reports of Tigers and Panthers and lesser tanks abandoned because of mechanical failures, because of lack of fuel, because the machines that were supposed to save Germany were eating themselves from within. Kepler was reassigned to an infantry unit. Bäumer never saw him again, but heard, months later, that he had surrendered to American forces in April, that he had survived, that he had gone home to Cologne and found his mother and sister alive in their basement. It was a small piece of good news in an ocean of loss, a single point of light in the darkness. Bäumer himself survived the war, though survival felt less like victory and more like punishment. He thought often of Richter and Weiss, of the way they had fallen in the snow, of how the Tiger's transmission had betrayed them all. Engineers had called it a masterpiece, this Maybach-Olvar system, this triumph of German precision. They had designed it in peacetime, tested it in controlled conditions, never imagining that it would be asked to function in Russian mud, French hedgerows, Belgian snow. They had built a machine for a war that existed only in their imaginations. And when real war came, with all its chaos and impossible demands, the machine broke. Years later, when military historians studied the Tiger I, they would note this weakness, this fatal flaw. They would write about how the transmission was over-engineered and under-tested, how it required constant maintenance that frontline conditions made impossible, how it failed at rates that made the Tiger unreliable despite its fearsome reputation. They would calculate that more Tigers were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy fire, that Germany's most powerful weapon was also its most fragile. But Bäumer did not need historians to tell him this. He had felt the transmission fail beneath him, had heard it scream its death cry. had watched good men die because a machine could not do what it was supposed to do. In his dreams, which never really stopped being nightmares, he was back in that frozen crossroads, back in that commander's cupola, and the grinding of failing gears was the only sound in all the world. The tiger had been a legend, and legends are supposed to be immortal. But immortality is just another lie that war tells, another promise that shatters under the weight of reality. In the end, it was not enemy shells or superior tactics that killed the tiger. It was its own heart, its own mechanical soul, the transmission that ground itself to death, trying to move a weight it was never truly designed to carry. And that, perhaps, was the real lesson. Not that the machine failed, but that the machine was always going to fail. That asking perfection in imperfect conditions was asking for tragedy. That the weakness was not in the gears and hydraulics but in the minds of men who believed that engineering alone could change the course of history. That a perfect machine could win an imperfect war. Bäumer lived into his 70s, long enough to see Germany rebuild, long enough to see the weapons of the war become museum pieces and cautionary tales. He never went to visit the restored tigers that sat in collections around the world, their transmissions replaced, their armor polished, their history sanitized. Those were not the tigers he remembered. The tiger he remembered was burning in a Belgian crossroads, its transmission seized, its crew scattered or dead. Another monument to the fatal gap between what we build and what we need, between what we design and what survives. On winter mornings, when the cold settled into his bones the way it had in January 1945, he would sometimes hear it again, the grinding of metal against metal, the scream of a machine pushed beyond its limits, the sound of something essential breaking, and he would remember Richter at the driver's controls, fighting levers that would not respond. He would remember Weiss going back for a fallen comrade in snow-stained red. He would remember Kepler's young face behind the gun sight, still believing that skill and courage mattered more than the mechanical heart beating beneath them. The transmission had been the tiger's fatal weakness, the historian said. But sitting in his small apartment decades later, an old man with too many memories and too few friends, Bäumer thought they had it wrong. The transmission was just metal and gears. The real weakness was in believing that any machine, no matter how perfect, could be stronger than the chaos it was built to face. The real weakness was in the hope that engineering could save what courage and sacrifice could not. And that weakness, he knew, was not limited to machines. It was human. It was eternal. It was the way men have always built towers that reach for heaven and then watch them crumble back to earth. The Tiger I was just one more tower, one more attempt to impose order on chaos, and its transmission was just the inevitable place where order broke and chaos came flooding in. In the end, that frozen morning at the crossroads in Belgium, the transmission had not just failed. It had told the truth that no one wanted to hear, that even the mightiest weapons are built by fallible hands, maintained by exhausted men, and asked to perform miracles in conditions where miracles do not exist. The grinding of those gears was not just mechanical failure. It was the sound of reality asserting itself, of hubris meeting consequence, of the moment when a legend discovered it was just a machine after all. And machines, no matter how legendary, eventually break,